The file sat in the Council's archive for 11 days before anyone opened it. It had come from a three-person scout crew assigned to survey a cluster of unremarkable systems near the edge of charted space. Most of their reports were dull. Rock worlds, gas giants, the occasional fungal bloom on a wet moon that somebody would classify and forget. But the third planet of the yellow star in Grid Sector 7 Rho was different, and the crew knew it the moment they dropped out of transit and ran their first passive scan. The planet was loud. Not loud in the way that volcanic worlds were loud, or the way gas giants threw off electromagnetic noise. This was structured noise. Thousands of overlapping signal frequencies, all of them artificial. Radio waves, microwave bursts, tight beam transmissions bouncing off orbital relays. The planet was wrapped in a shell of its own communication signals so dense that the scout ship's sensors had to filter through 17 layers just to get a clean surface reading. The xenobiologist on the crew, a careful and experienced researcher named Pellies, spent 2 days running analysis before she wrote her report. She was not a dramatic person. Her previous 40 reports read like instruction manuals, short sentences, numbered observations, no emotional language. Her report on the third planet of the yellow star was 1 paragraph long. It said, "Do not engage. These creatures are unlike anything we have cataloged. Recommend full Council review before any contact mission is authorized." Then she had the pilot turn the ship around and left. The Council reviewed the report on a slow administrative morning. 11 members were present. Darrow, who commanded the 7th Expansion Fleet and had attended the session only because his resupply requisitions needed a senior signature, read it over the shoulder of the counselor beside him and laughed quietly. 1 paragraph, no data tables, no biological breakdown, just do not engage. The counselor beside him, an old administrator named Foss, shrugged and moved to file it under low-priority observation. Darrow stopped him. Not because he was worried, because he was bored. He had subjugated 41 worlds in his career. Small ones, large ones, worlds with organized militaries and worlds with nothing but frightened populations who had never seen a ship that could leave their own atmosphere. The process was always the same. Show up, demonstrate firepower, receive surrender, file paperwork, move on. He told Foss he would handle it personally. It would be quick. He was already in the sector anyway. Nobody objected. Darrow signed his own requisition forms and left the chamber. His fleet entered the Yellow Star system 9 days later. 7 ships, a flagship, 2 destroyers, 3 troop carriers, and a mobile command platform. More than enough for a pre-interstellar civilization. The planet came into view on his forward screens, and Darrow stood at the viewport for a while just looking at it. It was genuinely strange to look at. Most habitable worlds settled into a pattern once life took hold. Spread of green or equivalent growth, clusters of water, clean atmospheric layers. This one looked like something had been fighting over it for a very long time. The surface was scarred in ways that were not geological. Vast stretches of land had been altered, cleared, rebuilt, altered again. The oceans were ringed with structures. Even the polar regions showed signs of habitation. Every available surface had something on it. His communications officer sent the standard first contact signal, translation protocols attached. The message was simple. This system is now under the authority of the Galactic Expansion Council. Surrender jurisdiction of your world and your species will be integrated peacefully. Resistance will result in necessary force. They waited. The response came back in 4 hours. It had taken the humans that long to run the translation in reverse and compose a reply. Considering they had never encountered another species before, 4 hours was actually fast, but Darrow did not think about that. The reply said, "We have received your message. We understand your position. You have been warned. This is not a surrender." Darrow read it twice. Then he handed it to his communications officer and told her to archive it. He was not angry. He was not worried. He had received defiant first responses before. It was almost traditional. Species with no context for what they were facing always assumed they had some chance. They did not understand yet that the fleet above them was not the largest thing the Council could send. They did not understand that 41 other worlds had said something similar and were now quiet, integrated, and obedient. He gave the order to prepare the first landing force. 200 soldiers, standard pacification loadout. They would drop to the surface of the largest continent, secure a population center, and the humans would see what they were dealing with. He gave them 3 days to complete the operation. He went to his quarters and slept. What he did not know, and what Pellies had tried to tell him in one careful paragraph, was that the planet below had been killing things and being killed by things for 4 billion years. The life on it had not developed in a comfortable environment. It had developed in a war. Every creature on the surface had been shaped by relentless pressure into something that survived not because the world was kind, but because it absolutely refused to stop. The humans were the latest version of that process. They had been watching Darrow's fleet since the moment it dropped out of transit. They had already started taking notes. The 200 soldiers landed at local dawn on a flat agricultural plain 2 kilometers outside a mid-sized human settlement. The drop was clean. No anti-air fire. No missile launches. The settlement showed heat signatures consistent with a sleeping population. The soldiers fanned out in standard formation, activated their sensor nets, and began the march toward the settlement perimeter. The unit commander, a veteran named Gren, had done this kind of operation 9 times. He knew what early resistance looked like. Panicked civilians. A few brave but untrained fighters with primitive weapons. Sometimes a local military unit that put up a real fight for an hour before realizing the situation. He expected this to follow that pattern. The settlement was quiet. Too quiet, but Gren had seen that before too. Fear did that to populations. They were 400 meters from the outer buildings when the first soldier stepped through a section of ground that was not ground. It was a covered pit, narrow enough that the sensor net had read it as solid soil, deep enough to matter. The soldier went in hard and the 2 behind him stopped to help, and in the 3 seconds they were stationary, a wire pulled tight across the path, and a salvaged fuel cell from one of the Council's own orbital survey drones, dropped months ago during a routine mapping pass, collected by humans, disassembled, and rebuilt into something new, detonated at knee height. Gren had never seen humans use Council technology against Council soldiers before. It was not supposed to be possible. The survey drones were coded to inert on unauthorized contact. The humans had bypassed the inert coding in whatever time they had between the fleet's arrival and the landing. Gren did not know how. He pulled his unit back and called for drone support. The drones swept the area. They found 41 additional traps across a half-kilometer approach corridor. Not random, planned, laid in a pattern that funneled any retreating force toward a secondary kill zone near the settlement's water infrastructure. Whoever had designed the trap layout understood how a retreating military unit would move. Gren called for the traps to be cleared by remote detonation. 17 of them detonated. 24 did not. The 24 were false targets, decoys placed to waste resources and confirm the real traps were elsewhere. He requested extraction and full aerial support. Back on the flagship, Darrow received the report without visible reaction. He approved the support request and went back to his data review. 1 unit, ambushed, not a catastrophic loss. Humans were clever, apparently. He would send more. The second force was 1,000 soldiers supported by 4 atmospheric gunships. They dropped across 3 locations simultaneously to prevent the kind of channeled ambush that had hit Gren's unit. Full sensor coverage from orbit. Gunships on continuous sweep. Communication links open to the flagship in real time. What they found waiting for them was not a military. There were no uniforms, no command vehicles, no organized defensive lines. What the sensors picked up in the hours after landing were small scattered groups of humans moving constantly, never staying in one place long enough to be targeted from the air. A gunship would get a lock on a heat cluster, and by the time the targeting solution resolved, the cluster had split into individuals moving in different directions through buildings. Underground, through drainage systems the orbital maps had not recorded because they were new, dug in the days since the fleet arrived. The humans were not fighting the way any species Darrow's forces had encountered before had fought. Every other species, when outgunned, either surrendered or made a final concentrated stand. It was logical. Concentrate force, make the cost high, accept the outcome. The humans did not concentrate. They dispersed and kept dispersing. They gave up ground constantly and never seemed to care about holding any specific location. What they held instead was time. On day 2, a gunship went down. Not from a missile. From a long cable strung between two buildings at rotor height, anchored with pitons driven into the walls by someone who had clearly studied the gunship's flight patterns from the day before and predicted where it would sweep next. The gunship was not destroyed. It was grounded. Within 20 minutes, a group of humans with cutting tools had reached it and were pulling panels off the engine housing. They were not looting it, they were learning it. By day 5, Gren's replacement commander, a harder officer named Solt, had lost 60 soldiers and 2 more gunships. He had confirmed kills on 11 humans. 11. The sensor footage was reviewed 3 times because nobody believed it. On day 6, Solt reported that his forces were no longer able to hold their landing positions and requested immediate reinforcement or withdrawal authorization. Darrow sat in the flagship's command room and read the report slowly. 41 worlds. He had done this 41 times. He had never once requested withdrawal authorization. He had never once had a unit report that it could not hold a position against a pre-interstellar population. He sent reinforcement authorization and called a full briefing of his senior officers. The briefing room was quiet in a way briefing rooms were not usually quiet. His officers were professionals. They did not show fear easily, but the footage from Solt's unit was playing on the display and the officers were watching it with expressions Darrow did not like. One of them, a logistics commander named Tav, said quietly that the humans were not fighting to win individual engagements. They were fighting to keep fighting. Darrow understood the difference. He had never had to think about it before because no species had ever made that distinction matter. He ordered 3 times the previous force to be ready for deployment within 48 hours. Outside the viewport, the planet below continued its rotation. Calm and blue and patient, Voss had not planned to read the full scout file. She had pulled it from the archive during a routine review of flagged low-priority entries and expected to close it in 10 minutes. 3 hours later, she was still sitting in her office with the lights dimmed, and the holographic display throwing amber light across her face. Pelly's had attached appendices to her report, 7 of them. The main report was 1 paragraph, but the appendices were detailed in the way that only someone genuinely unsettled puts together, thorough, compulsive, like building a wall against something coming. The first appendix covered the planet's biological history. Voss had reviewed biological histories before and they were usually straightforward. A species dominated. Things below it adapted or disappeared. Equilibrium settled in. The third planet of the yellow star had no equilibrium. It had a 4 billion-year record of mass extinction events followed by explosive regrowth, each cycle producing life that was harder and more adaptable than the last. 5 times the dominant life had been nearly wiped out. 5 times something had survived in the margins and rebuilt. The second appendix covered climate. The planet's axial tilt produced extreme seasonal variation. Its orbital path was not perfectly stable. In the last 100,000 years alone, it had cycled through multiple ice ages and warming periods severe enough to reshape coastlines and eliminate habitats. Species that could not adapt to rapid environmental shifts had no history on this world. The third appendix was the one that made Voss stop and read twice. It covered the humans specifically, their emergence, their spread. In a period that Pelly's had calculated as extraordinarily short by any galactic standard, humans had covered every climate zone on the planet, not just the comfortable temperate zones, the deep deserts, the frozen poles, the high altitudes where the air was barely breathable, the dense equatorial jungles, They had not adapted biologically to most of these environments. They were not built for extreme cold or extreme heat or high altitude. They had survived them anyway through constructed shelter, modified clothing, organized food storage, and what Pellies described in a careful footnote as an apparent psychological inability to accept that a given environment was not survivable. She had written that last part in neutral scientific language, but Voss could read what was underneath it. They just kept going. The fourth appendix documented the human's history of internal conflict. This was the part the council had seen the summary of and used to conclude that humans were too divided to pose a unified threat. Voss read the full version. It was true that humans fought each other, constantly, across their entire recorded history. Wars over land, resources, beliefs, perceived insults, succession of leadership. The council's analysis had read this as weakness. Pellies had read it differently. Every conflict in human history had been a testing ground. Every war had accelerated their development of logistics, communication, medicine, engineering, and strategy. Species that lived in peace developed slowly. The humans had developed under constant competitive pressure from themselves as well as from every environmental threat their world threw at them. The wars were not a sign of weakness. They were the training. Voss closed the appendices and sat for a moment. Then she opened a direct channel to Darrow's flagship. He took 11 minutes to respond, which meant he had considered not responding at all. When his face appeared on the display, he looked impatient. Voss told him she had read the full scout file. She told him she thought he should withdraw, not retreat, withdraw. Come back with a diplomatic team and a different approach. Darrow looked at her the way experienced commanders sometimes looked at council members who had never left an administrative station. Politely, carefully, not listening. He told her the operation was progressing. There had been unexpected complications, but they were being addressed. He expected resolution within the week. Voss asked him how many soldiers he had lost. He told her the numbers were within acceptable operational parameters. She asked him what the humans had done with the downed gunships. He paused. Then he told her they had been recovered and destroyed before the humans could make use of them. This was not true. Voss had already read Solt's raw field reports, which had been copied to the council archive automatically. 2 of the 3 downed gunships had not been recovered. The humans had reached them first. She did not tell Darrow she knew he was wrong. She told him she was formally registering a request that he consider the withdrawal option. She told him she was going to convene an emergency scientific review of the planet's biological data. He thanked her for her concern and ended the transmission. Voss sat back and looked at the display, which still showed the planet rotating slowly in the holographic field. She thought about something in Pellies' 7th appendix, the shortest one. It was just 2 paragraphs. It described a behavior Pellies had observed in the signal traffic she had analyzed before turning the ship around. Human communication networks, even under normal conditions, carried an extraordinary volume of content that was not functional, not navigation data or logistics or governance. Stories, arguments, art, humor. Constant exchanges of ideas between individuals who had no practical reason to be in contact with each other. Pellies had written that she did not know what it meant, but she had found it more unsettling than anything else in her survey. Voss thought she understood what it meant. It meant the humans were never isolated. Even a single human in a remote location was still connected to the thinking of billions of others. They had built an external memory, a shared mind spread across the whole planet. Whatever one of them figured out, all of them eventually knew. She began drafting her emergency review request and worked through the rest of the night. On the planet below, in a salvaged alien gunship bay converted into a workshop, a 26-year-old mechanical engineering student was explaining to a group of 40 people how the Council's atmospheric gunship propulsion system worked. She had figured it out in a day and a half. Darrow made the decision on the morning of the 16th day, and he made it alone. Orbital bombardment was not his preferred tool. It was expensive. It left the infrastructure of a world damaged and harder to integrate, and it required council ratification for civilian targets. He had the ratification forms pre-signed for exactly this kind of stalled operation. He had never used them before. He used them now. 3 population centers, not the largest ones, chosen specifically because the field reports had identified them as coordination hubs, places where human groups had been observed gathering and communicating between dispersed cells. The logic was sound. Remove the coordination. Fragment the resistance. Let the dispersed cells exhaust themselves without direction. The strikes took 4 minutes. Darrow watched the footage on the command display and felt nothing except the practical satisfaction of a decision executed cleanly. Then he went to his desk and began drafting the next phase orders. He expected the human communication networks to go quiet. Species under bombardment went quiet. It was shock. A period of silence followed by either surrender signals or a final desperate conventional military response, which his fleet would handle easily. The human networks did not go quiet. Within 3 hours of the strikes, the signal traffic had actually increased. Not just increased, changed in structure. The fragmented local communication he had observed before, which had been difficult to trace and map, was now being replaced by something more organized, not centralized. The humans were not routing everything through one point, which would have been easy to disrupt. They were doing something his communications officer had no existing model for. She called it distributed consensus. Every node talking to every nearby node simultaneously, sharing information and decision-making across the whole network without any single point of control. Like a biological system, like a nervous system with no brain to target. He had destroyed 3 coordination hubs. The humans had responded by eliminating the concept of a coordination hub. On day 19, his destroyer Cable reported a proximity alert. The object that had triggered the alert was not in any of their pre-mission databases because it had not existed before the mission. It was a spacecraft, approximately 40 meters long. Its hull was a patchwork of materials that the Cable's sensors identified as salvaged panels from 2 of the downed gunships, sections of pre-existing human orbital infrastructure, and what appeared to be the external casing of a Council atmospheric drone, flattened and cut into strips and welded over a frame of human-manufactured steel. It was not a warship. It had no coherent weapon system. What it had was a payload. The humans had packed the forward section with the fuel cells from the salvaged gunships, wired in series, and given the whole thing a simple burn-and-release guidance system that did not require any sophisticated targeting computer, because it did not need to hit a specific point on the Cable. It just needed to get close. The Cable's point defense system was designed to handle Council pattern munitions because that was what point defense systems were designed for. This was not a Council pattern munition. It was not any pattern. The point defense engaged and destroyed 60% of the object before impact. The remaining 40% struck the Cable's engine section at low velocity, and the fuel cell array detonated on contact. The Cable did not explode. It vented atmosphere from 2 sections and lost primary propulsion. It went into a slow drift and had to be taken under tow by one of the troop carriers. Darrow read the damage report and then read it again. 43 days ago, these people had not known alien spacecraft existed. Now they had built one. It was ugly and primitive, and it had still taken one of his destroyers out of the operation. He called a full command briefing, all senior officers, in person, not over the link because he did not want this recorded in the standard logs. He told them what he was not going to put in the official report, that the human counter-technology development rate was unlike anything in Council records, that the bombardment had not broken resistance but had accelerated something, that the distributed communication network was now effectively unjammable with the tools he had available because it had no center to jam. Tav, his logistics officer, said carefully that the humans seemed to be treating each new problem like a design brief. Someone else asked what that meant. Tav said it meant they were not experiencing the operation as a series of disasters. They were experiencing it as a series of engineering challenges, and they were iterating. The room was quiet. Darrow asked for options. His officers gave him three: escalate bombardment to a scale that would require full council authorization and would take weeks to obtain; attempt direct negotiation, which nobody in the room could frame as anything other than admission of difficulty; or maintain current pressure while waiting for human endurance to fail. Nobody said the third option was working. Nobody had to. Back on the planet, in 17 separate locations across 4 continents, teams of humans were dismantling the second prototype spacecraft that had not launched yet, because the first one had taught them things, and they wanted to apply what they had learned before sending the next one up. They had identified 4 improvements in 72 hours. They were already arguing cheerfully about a fifth. Nobody in the Council's military history had ever modeled a scenario where a pre-interstellar species could coordinate a simultaneous multi-point strike across an entire orbital theater. The reason nobody had modeled it was the same reason Darrow had not worried about it. Species that had not left their own atmosphere did not have the infrastructure to act in orbital space. They could not see what was up there clearly enough, could not communicate across the distances fast enough, and could not get assets into position without being detected and destroyed on ascent. The humans solved all 3 problems in ways that should not have worked and did. The seeing problem they solved with math. They had been watching the fleet for weeks using every ground-based optical and radio instrument they had, and a group of astronomers and signal analysts had built a positional model of every ship in Darrow's fleet accurate to within 50 meters. They did not need alien sensor technology. They had been mapping stars for centuries. Mapping 7 ships in close orbit was not a significant additional challenge. The communication problem they solved with a system that Darrow's communications officer still did not fully understand even after reviewing the intercepts. The humans used their existing global communication network, but added a timing layer, a synchronized pulse transmitted through dozens of independent channels simultaneously, so that even if 80% of the channels were jammed, the remaining 20% carried enough of the signal to reconstruct the full message. They had designed it in 4 days. It worked the first time they tested it. The ascent problem they solved with numbers, and with something Darrow's tactical officers had no category for, which was the willingness to accept loss as a design parameter. They launched 9 vehicles in the strike, not all from the same location, not all at the same time. Staggered launches from 4 continents over a 6-hour window, timed so that the point defense systems on the fleet would be engaging throughout the window and could not fully reset between contacts. 7 of the 9 vehicles were destroyed on ascent or shortly after. 2 reached their targets. The first hit the Mobile Command Platform's communications array. The platform was not destroyed. The communications array was. The fleet's internal coordination link dropped to short-range ship-to-ship only, which meant Darrow's flagship could no longer simultaneously direct all 7 vessels. Orders had to be relayed. Relay took time. Time created gaps. The second vehicle did not hit anything. It detonated at a calculated point between the flagship and the 2 remaining functional destroyers, and the debris field from the detonation damaged sensors on all 3 vessels simultaneously. In the gap that followed, 12 minutes during which Darrow was managing damage reports, trying to restore communications, and reorganizing a command structure that had just lost its central relay. The ground forces on 2 continents executed a series of coordinated attacks that collapsed 3 forward operating positions. Solt's replacement, a methodical officer named Bear, filed the position loss reports in real time and received no response from the flagship for 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, Bear made a decision. She ordered a tactical withdrawal to the primary landing zone and began preparing for evacuation. She did not have authorization. She acted anyway, because every hour of this operation had taught her that waiting for a plan to work was not working, and a species that used 12 minutes to collapse 3 positions would use the next 12 to collapse more. She was right. The humans had expected the delay and had pre-positioned for it. When communications restored and Darrow reached Bear, she had already pulled 400 soldiers back from positions that were gone by the time his authorization would have arrived. He did not reprimand her. He did not have the certainty for it anymore. The fleet had been in this system for 31 days. Darrow's total confirmed human casualties from all operations combined were slightly under 200. His own losses were 412 soldiers, 1 destroyer mission killed, 1 destroyer under repair, the mobile command platform operating at reduced capacity, and 3 troop carriers that had taken minor strike damage during the 9-vehicle ascent operation. He sat in the command room with those numbers in front of him, and for the first time in his career, felt the specific weight of a campaign going wrong. His door signal chimed. His aide told him that a human shuttle had just cleared the upper atmosphere under a signal flag he did not recognize. It was not an attack configuration. It was something else. The translation came through 4 minutes later. The signal was a request to dock. Not a surrender, not a ceasefire offer, a request to send a representative aboard. Darrow stared at the translation for a long time. Then he did something he also could not have explained clearly if asked. He authorized the docking. He cleared a section of his hangar. He told his security team to stand ready but not to draw weapons unless he gave the order. The human shuttle was battered. Its hull showed heat scarring from the ascent and what appeared to be 2 separate patch repairs done mid-flight. It landed in the hangar with a slightly off-center touch that suggested the pilot was working with imperfect controls and correcting constantly. 1 person got out. She was unremarkable by the physical standards of the species. Medium height, dark hair cut short for practical reasons, a jacket that had once been some kind of uniform but had been repaired and modified so many times it was hard to tell. She carried nothing visible that could be considered a weapon. She looked at the hangar around her, at the alien materials and the alien scale and the armed guards at every exit, with the expression of someone taking in useful information. She asked, through a small translation device she had brought herself, to speak with whoever was in charge. She said she was not there to negotiate surrender. She said she was there to offer Darrow a way to leave with his ships intact and his remaining soldiers alive. Darrow told his security team to bring her to the briefing room. He wanted to hear what she had to say. Her name was Rue, and she sat across from Darrow in the briefing room without fidgeting. Most species fidgeted in that room. It was designed to project authority, high ceiling, cold light. The chair on the other side of the table was slightly lower than Darrow's, a detail so subtle that most visitors did not consciously notice it but responded to anyway. Rue had apparently noticed it immediately because she had pulled the chair back from the table, turned it 45 degrees, and sat sideways with one arm resting on the back, which completely removed the dynamic the room was built to create. Darrow found that interesting. He asked her how she had been chosen for this. She said she had volunteered. Then she said that approximately 900 people had also volunteered, and they had selected her because she had the most experience with the gunship propulsion systems, and the council would probably want to ask about that. Darrow had not said anything about the gunships. She had offered it as a demonstration that they understood what he would want to know, and that they were choosing what to share rather than being interrogated into it. He changed his approach. He asked her what she was offering. She said, full withdrawal of his fleet, with all remaining soldiers and all ships, unharassed, in exchange for a guarantee that no council fleet would return to this system for a minimum of 100 years. She said the humans understood they could not enforce such a guarantee with current technology. She said they were offering it in the expectation that the council would find the cost of returning within that period to be higher than the cost of waiting. Darrow asked her why 100 years specifically. She said that in 100 years, given current development trajectories, they would be significantly better at this. She did not say it as a threat. She said it as a fact. Darrow looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. She did not perform confidence. She simply had it in the way people have things that are not performances. He asked her one question that was not tactical. He asked her how they had done it, Not any specific operation. All of it. The speed. The adaptation. The willingness to lose 7 vehicles to get 2 through, to accept those losses as a reasonable trade. Ruth thought about it for a moment. She said that humans had a concept, not unique to them but very deeply embedded, that the purpose of a hard thing was to make you able to do the next hard thing, that losing was information, that the goal was never the first version of a solution. It was the version that worked, however many attempts that took. She said her species had been doing this for so long that it was basically biological at this point. Then she said something Darrow had not expected. She said she was sorry about his soldiers, the ones who had died. She said that humans understood what it cost a family to lose someone, and that they were not glad about those losses even if they had caused them. She said this without any apparent political calculation, as if it were simply a true thing and therefore worth saying. Darrow did not know what to do with that. He accepted the terms. The fleet pulled out of the system over the next 18 hours. The ground forces were extracted in organized lifts, unharassed as promised. No human weapon fired at a departing ship. When the last transport cleared the upper atmosphere, Rue's shuttle had already left the flagship and was on its way back to the surface. The only communication the fleet received during the withdrawal was a single short message through the translation channel. It said, "Safe travels," nothing else. Darrow filed his after-action report on the transit back to Council space. He was honest in it, completely honest, which was unusual, and which his aide warned him might create political difficulties. He wrote that the operation had failed by every measurable metric. He wrote that the human species represented a category of threat that existing Council frameworks did not adequately describe. He wrote his honest assessment of their development rate, their communication architecture, their psychological tolerance for loss as a function of iteration, and the fact that they had offered him a withdrawal rather than continuing to fight. That last part confused his aide more than anything else in the report. She asked him why they had done that. They had the momentum. They could have pressed. Darrow said he had thought about that for the entire transit. He thought they had done it because they were already thinking past the current conflict. That continuing to grind down his fleet served no purpose they cared about more than getting the fleet to leave. They were not interested in demonstrating dominance. They were interested in the outcome. And the outcome they wanted was achievable without more fighting, so they had stopped the fighting. It was, he told his aide, an extremely pragmatic form of mercy. At the Galactic Council, Voss received the report before anyone else and read it 3 times. Then she called an emergency session and presented her case for Category 7 classification. She presented Pelly's appendices. She presented the after-action data. She presented a projection of human development capability at 5, 20, and 50-year intervals. The vote was unanimous. Category 7, the first species ever classified that way without having left their home system. The new warning went out across the entire network. It was much longer than Pelly's 1 paragraph. It explained everything. It ended with a single operational recommendation. Do not approach, do not engage, and under no circumstances assume that the current state of their technology represents the ceiling of their capability. Somewhere in a Council medical station, Darrow sat in a recovery ward being treated for stress-related cardiovascular strain, a condition that was embarrassingly common in commanders who had experienced prolonged high-stakes campaigns, and watched the Council broadcast the new classification. An observer from the Council's Science Division came to ask him the question everyone was asking. What did they remind you of? Darrow thought about Rue sitting sideways in his chair. He thought about the trap layouts that understood military movement patterns. He thought about the message, safe travels. He said they reminded him of what his own species had been like before they got comfortable. Before centuries of relative peace had made winning feel like something that happened to you rather than something you built, piece by piece, out of every failure you had survived. He said it without bitterness, just the specific weight of someone who had learned something true and was still deciding what to do with it. Back on the 3rd planet of the Yellow Star, in a converted gunship workshop. The engineering student who had reverse-engineered the propulsion system was already 3 pages into a notebook of ideas for what to try next. Nobody had asked her to, she just could not stop thinking.